Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The Disappearance of Flight 19, Chapter 1, Introduction. On a quiet afternoon in early December 1945, 5 U.S. Navy torpedo bombers lifted off from Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale in Florida. It was shortly after 2 p.m. on December 5th, and the flight of Avengers, designated Flight 19, was embarking on what should have been a routine overwater training exercise. The skies were fair, the sea below glistened, with only scattered clouds on the horizon. The men aboard these aircraft were mostly young trainees, guided by an experienced instructor pilot. They expected to be home by dusk. Yet just a few hours later, all 5 planes had disappeared without a trace. 14 airmen were simply gone, and airily, so were 13 more rescuers sent to find them. The loss of Flight 19 in the area that would later be dubbed the Bermuda Triangle has since become one of aviation's most haunting mysteries. How could a routine mission on a clear day end in utter disappearance? In this episode, we will explore the full story of Flight 19 in a calm and measured tone. We'll journey through the mission's background, the distressing radio calls as the flight becomes lost, the massive search that followed, and the investigation and theories, both ordinary and bizarre, that try to explain the fate of the lost patrol. As we delve into the details, allow the narrative to unfold gently. Picture the scene, the buzz of the aircraft engine fading into the distance, the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean stretching below, and later, the quiet that followed when the radio contact was lost. This story is tragic, but we will recount it thoughtfully and thoroughly. So make yourselves comfortable as we begin our slow-paced journey back to that day in 1945, tracing the path of Flight 19 and the questions that still linger in its wake. Chapter 2, Flight 19 and its mission profile. Flight 19 consisted of 5 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, rugged, single-engine Navy aircraft that had proven themselves during World War II. The TBM Avenger, also known as the TBF when built by Grumman, and TBM when built by General Motors, was a sturdy plane designed for combat in naval patrols. Each carried a 3-man crew, a pilot, a radio man, and a gunner. By late 1945, these particular Avengers were being used to train new pilots in navigation and bombing practice. Flight 19 was such training mission, officially called Navigation Problem 1. This exercise was essentially a triangular flight route combined with a practice bombing run. It was a standard drill that many student aviators had flown before. In fact, another group, Flight 18, had successfully completed the same exercise earlier that day, indicating conditions were normal in the mission routine. The flight was scheduled to fly a triangular path over the ocean, first due east from Fort Lauderdale to drop practice bombs at Hens and Chickens Shoal, then turn north towards Grand Bahama Island, and finally a long southwest leg back towards the Florida coast. The entire route would cover roughly 300 nautical miles and was expected to take about 2 to 3 hours. Weather forecasts for December 5, 1945 were generally favorable, warm and clear skies, with only light winds and scattered showers in the area. Nothing unusual was anticipated that afternoon. A total of 14 men were aboard Flight 19's 5 planes. Each Avenger had a pilot and crewmen, except one aircraft, which only had 2 men because a third was excused ill. All trainees and crew were well trained, and in several cases, combat veterans of World War II. Leading the flight was Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, a 28 years old U.S. Navy Reserve pilot. Lieutenant Taylor was an experienced aviator with approximately 2,500 flying hours, over 600 of those in Avenger torpedo bombers. During the war, he had flown missions off an aircraft carrier, the USS Hancock, in the Pacific, and he had several years of experience as a flight instructor. By November 1945, Taylor had been transferred to Fort Lauderdale from NAS Miami, so he was familiar with the region's geography and weather patterns. In short, he was considered a skilled pilot and a dependable teacher. 4 of the Avengers in Flight 19 were piloted by his students, Marine Captain Edward J. Powers and George W. Stivers, Marine Second Lieutenant Forrest J. Gerber, and Navy Ensign Joseph T. Bossy. Each of these trainees had around 300 total flight hours, with about 50 to 60 in Avengers. So while less experienced than Taylor, they were not brand new flyers. It's worth noting that one of them, Captain Powers, was actually senior in military rank to Taylor as a Marine captain, but on this training hop, Taylor was the instructor in charge. There were small quirks noted before takeoff. For instance, during the pre-flight checks, it was discovered that none of the planes had working clock aboard. This wasn't considered a serious issue. Everyone presumed the pilot had their own wristwatches to track time for navigation. The Avengers were otherwise fully fueled and in good working order. At Fort Lauderdale, the weather was described as favorable, sea state moderate to rough, meaning the ocean had some waves but nothing out of the ordinary for a flight over water. The only minor delay was that Lieutenant Taylor arrived a bit late for the briefing, which pushed the takeoff from planned 1:45 p.m. to about 2:10 p.m. Around that time, the 5 Avengers taxied out and took to the air, forming up as Flight 19 and heading east into the afternoon sun. At first, everything proceeded like clockwork. The flight reached the first checkpoint, the shallow waters of Hens and Chicken Shoals, just north of Bimini in the Bahamas, where they were to practice a low-level bombing run. Around 3 p.m., radio operators at Fort Lauderdale heard the routine chatter of the pilots coordinating their practice bomb drops. One pilot was heard saying, "I've got one more bomb," and another replied, "Go ahead and drop it." The tone was casual and normal. By about 3:30 p.m., Flight 19 had completed the bombing exercise successfully. Lieutenant Taylor then ordered the flight to turn north for the second leg of the triangular route, flying roughly parallel to the Bahamas. The planes climbed to cruising altitude and settled in for what should have been another hour or so of navigation practice before turning for home. At that point, none of the airmen could have imagined that their day was about to take a horrible turn. Chapter 3. First Signs of Trouble. For about 30 minutes after the bombing run, Flight 19 flew north-northeast without incident. Then, around 3:40 p.m., the first hint of trouble crackled over the radio airwaves. An unidentified voice from one of Flight 19's planes transmitted on the training frequency, sounding a bit confused. He asked another pilot for a compass reading. Essentially, "What's your heading? I don't know where we are." The reply that came back was disconcerting. "I don't know where we are. We must have gotten lost after that last turn." This was the first red flag. Navy flight instructors monitoring radio channels immediately took notice. A student pilot admitting "I don't know where we are" was not routine at all. Moments later, the voice of Lieutenant Charles Taylor himself came on the air, transmitting to anyone listening on the flight frequency. Taylor's tone was anxious. He reported that his compasses were not working. "In fact," he said, "both my compasses are out and I am trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida." He then added a baffling piece of information. "I am over land, but it's broken. I'm sure I'm in the Florida Keys, but I don't know how far down and I don't know how to get to Fort Lauderdale." Hearing this, those on the ground realized something had gone very wrong. The Florida Keys, a string of islands extending southwest from mainland Florida, were hundreds of miles from Flight 19's intended route. If Taylor truly thought he was over the Keys, he was badly mistaken about his location. In reality, based on the flight's last known course, he should have been somewhere over the open Atlantic, likely northeast of the Bahamas and east of Florida Peninsula. But Taylor sounded convinced he had somehow ended up in the Gulf of Mexico, on the other side of Florida. A senior flight instructor named Lieutenant Robert F. Cox was airborne nearby, leading another exercise with call sign FT-74, and overheard Flight 19's distress call. Cox quickly interjected to offer assistance. Over the radio, Cox called out to the lost flight, addressing Taylor. "FT-28, that's Taylor's call sign. This is FT-74. What's your trouble?" After a few moments, Taylor responded, repeating that both his compasses were out and he believed he was somewhere over the Florida Keys. Cox, realizing Taylor was disoriented, tried to guide him with simple instructions. If Taylor was convinced he was in the Keys, the logical solution, if that were true, was to fly north until reaching Miami, then Fort Lauderdale. Cox told Taylor something to the effect of, "Put the sun on your port wing and fly north up the coast. When you get to Miami, Fort Lauderdale is only about 20 miles further." Cox also asked Taylor for his current altitude. Taylor replied he was at 2,300 feet and offered to meet him halfway to guide him in. At first, Taylor demurred, saying, "I know where I am now. Don't come after me." He seemed momentarily confident he could navigate back. However, as minutes passed, it became clear that Taylor did not actually have things under control. Ground stations and other aircraft began working frantically to assist Flight 19. The radio traffic became a flurry of transmissions. Fort Lauderdale's control tower, Navy radio at Port Everglades, and even NAS Miami picked up pieces of the conversations. At one point, the Fort Lauderdale station asked Cox to verify Flight 19's call sign because Taylor had mistakenly identified himself as MT-28 instead of the correct FT-28, perhaps due to garbled communication. Taylor soon corrected this, confirming he was FT-28, the leader of Flight 19. He then radioed an unsettling request. "Can you have Miami or someone turn on their radar gear and pick us up?" We don't seem to be getting far. We were out on a navigational hop. On the second leg, I thought the students, were going wrong, so I took over. Now I know it's my compasses that are wrong." In this transmission, Taylor essentially admitted that he had lost trust in his instruments and had assumed command from his students because he thought they were wrong, only to realize that he might have misled them due to faulty compass readings. As 4 p.m. approached, attempts were made to steer Flight 19 towards land by using any means possible. Base radio operators recommended switching frequencies to search and rescue channel so they could hone in on the Avengers signal. But Taylor refused to change frequency, worried about losing contact with his other planes in the formation. He said, "I must keep my planes intact," indicating he feared splitting up the group if they fumbled a frequency change. Ground Station also asked Taylor to turn on his IFF transmitter, an emergency homing beacon, but whether he did so is unclear. Taylor at one point told Cox negative when asked about IFF, and later it was reported that Flight 19's signal was too weak or intermittent to get a fix. Meanwhile, Taylor's students were not silent. Some had functioning compasses and likely realized that Taylor's instincts were wrong. Several of the other pilots urged flying west towards Florida. One voice, possibly Captain Edward Powers, was heard saying over the air, "Damn it, if we just fly west, we would get home." Another said plainly, "We just ought to fly west." But Taylor, still thinking he might be south of Florida in the Gulf, responded to the effect, "If we fly west, we'll just get further out to sea." He was fundamentally turned around, mistaking east for west in terms of which direction led to the mainland. Chapter 4. Confusion and Course Changes. Throughout the 4 o'clock hour, the saga of Flight 19 grew ever more perplexing and tense, even as we recounted calmly now. Radio communications were intermittent, sometimes clear, sometimes garbled by static. Flight 19's planes had spread out somewhat, making it harder for both the pilots to see each other and for ground stations to get a fix. They were struggling with dead reckoning navigation. Without reliable compasses, Taylor was trying to guide the group by what he could see and by estimating how far they'd flown. But with the low-lying islands of the Bahamas dotting the ocean below, it seems he misidentified the islands and thus misjudged his position drastically. Navy investigators later concluded that Taylor had likely mistaken some small islands in the Bahamas for the Florida Keys, which is why he insisted he was in the wrong place. This was a tragic navigational error, believing he was south of Florida when he was actually east of Florida. By about 4:45 p.m., Taylor was heard formulating a plan. In one transmission picked up by a radio DF, direction finder station, he announced to his flight, "We are heading 030, northeast for 45 minutes, then we will fly north to make sure we are not over the Gulf of Mexico." This statement is very telling. It showed that Taylor strongly suspected they might have somehow drifted far west into the Gulf, on Florida's other side, a scenario that was virtually impossible given their flight path. But he didn't know that. So, to avoid the imagined danger of being over the Gulf, he wanted to head northeast for 45 minutes, then turn north, essentially trying to find Florida by approaching it from the Gulf side. Unfortunately, if they were actually over the Atlantic, which they were, flying northeast only took them further out to sea. Some of the Flight 19 pilots clearly disagreed with this plan. They believed they were nowhere near the Gulf. Their instincts told them they must be in the Atlantic east of Florida, and therefore heading west was the way home. There's evidence that one or more of the students attempted to take the lead or suggest a different course. In fact, later testimonies revealed that both Ensign Bossy and Captain Powers, the highest-ranking trainee, made suggestions over the radio that they change course, essentially challenging Taylor's decision. However, Flight 19 was still a military exercise, and Taylor was the designated instructor. Despite their private doubts, the other pilots continued to follow Taylor's orders and stayed with their leader. Military discipline and the chain of command mentality likely prevented any of the trainees from outright breaking formation and striking off on their own to the west. Finally, around 5 p.m., as the situation remained unresolved, Taylor appeared to relent slightly to his pilot's pleas. He was heard saying something like, "All right, heading 270, we'll fly west." For the first time, Flight 19 turned and flew due west, which was exactly the direction they needed to go to reach the Florida coastline. This gave a glimmer of hope to those monitoring the radios. If the Lost Avengers held a due west course for even 20 to 30 minutes, they very likely would sight land somewhere in Florida. In fact, multiple Navy radio towers were working together to triangulate Flight 19's position by this point. By approximately 5:50 p.m., 2 radio direction finding stations, one at NAS Fort Lauderdale and one at NAS Jacksonville, managed to get cross bearings that put Flight 19 somewhere in the open Atlantic, roughly within 100 miles radius of 29 degrees north, 79 degrees west. This location is well north of the Bahamas, about 200 miles offshore, east of Daytona Beach, Florida. If that fix was correct, and later analysis suggests it was reasonably accurate, it meant Flight 19 was not anywhere near the Florida Keys as Taylor thought, but rather far to the northeast, essentially parallel to the coast of northern Florida. Moreover, at that time, 5:50 p.m., they were on a course of 270 degrees west, which was exactly what they needed. Had they continued west from that point, they likely would have come ashore somewhere near the Florida-Georgia coastline. However, fate would not be so kind. As minutes ticked by, a new challenge was rapidly developing: sunset and a change in the weather. Chapter 5: Deteriorating Weather and Dwindling Fuel. The late afternoon light was beginning to wane. In early December, the sun in that region set around 5:30 p.m. What had been a warm, sunny day was now transforming. A weather system was moving in from the north. By early evening, conditions over the Atlantic had worsened. Scattered rain squalls were appearing. Winds had picked up to 25 to 30 knots, and waves down below were growing into rough, choppy swells. The previously clear horizon became overcast with clouds and patches of rain. For Flight 19, still lost over the ocean, this was very bad news. They had already been flying for over 3.5 hours, and their fuel reserves were running low. Each TBM Avenger carried a fuel supply for roughly 5 to 6 hours of flight under normal cruise power. But by 5:30 or 6 p.m., given the extra maneuvering and possible throttling up and down during their navigation confusion, their fuel gauges would have been edging towards empty. As darkness fell, The ability of Flight 19's pilot to orient themselves became almost nil. In 1945, these planes had no GPS or modern navigation aids. Once night came, if they were not within sight of land, they would be surrounded by blackness, just the faint glow of instrument dials and the static crackle of radio in their ears. The anxiety in the flight must have been high, though Lieutenant Taylor tried to keep his tone calm in transmissions so as not to panic his students. Around 6:04 p.m., Taylor made a fateful decision. Despite having earlier agreed, under pressure from his crew, to fly west, he suddenly changed course again. He was heard announcing, "We didn't fly far enough east. We may as well just turn around and fly east again." Essentially, he became convinced once more that he might indeed be in the Gulf of Mexico, and that the westward heading hadn't shown land yet, because they were still too far south. So believing he hadn't actually gone far enough east initially, he reversed direction to the east, which, if they were near 29 degrees north, 79 degrees west, as the triangulation suggested, meant he was now steering the flight away from the Florida mainland and back out to sea. This back and forth course change sealed Flight 19's fate. After 6 p.m., the radio signals from the flight grew weaker and more sporadic. Several listening posts could only catch fragments of what was being said among the aircraft. At one point, a pilot, not Taylor, perhaps one of the students, was heard in a strained voice saying, "We may have to ditch any minute." Ditching refers to making an emergency landing at sea, a dangerous prospect, especially at night. The ocean below was now rough, with white-capped waves and rain. If the Avengers were to go into the water, it would be extremely difficult for them to land intact, or for the crewmen to survive long in these conditions. They likely only had inflatable life rafts and life vests, and the water, while not frigid, would be cold enough to sap strength after a few hours. Back on land, various Navy and Coast Guard stations were preparing search and rescue operations, even as they struggled to locate Flight 19 by radio. The men in the aircraft were certainly aware that their situation was dire. Sometimes between 6:20 and 7 p.m., Lieutenant Taylor gave a final instruction to his squadron that was picked up faintly over the radio, demonstrating that he was still thinking of his men's safety. He calmly told them to stick together and get ready to ditch. In his last known transmission, logged at approximately 7:04 p.m., Taylor's voice was heard saying, "All planes close up tight. We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together." This message, though broken up by static, conveyed a tragic resolve. They would attempt to land in the ocean as a group once one plane was nearly out of fuel, to maximize their chance of rescue. Taylor wanted them to ditch together so that they could possibly form a unit on the water, deploying their life rafts and helping each other until help arrived. Shortly after that transmission, radio listeners on the Florida coast reported hearing what sounded like a few minutes of confused chatter, multiple voices either overlapping or coming through with static, and then one by one the voices fell silent. By a bit after 7 p.m., there were no further communication from Flight 19. The 5 Avengers had vanished into the night. Whether they attempted a coordinated ditching at exactly that time, or whether they staggered down as each ran out of fuel, no one on the ground could tell. All that followed was an eerie silence and the relentless static of an empty ocean at night. We can only imagine the final moments aboard these planes. The darkness, perhaps the reflection of starlight or the moon on the turbulent water below. The pilots straining to see each other's flights. Avengers would have had instrument lights and maybe very dim formation lights, and then the sputtering of engines as fuel ran out. One by one, each aircraft would have nosedived down into the Black Sea, either crashing on impact or skimming the waves to land and promptly begin sinking. The time was likely around 7:20 p.m., approximately 5 hours after takeoff, when Flight 19 met its end. It happened so suddenly and in such poor conditions that no further distress signals were picked up. The ocean, vast and unforgiving, simply swallowed them up. Chapter 6: The Search and Rescue Operation. When it became clear by early evening that Flight 19 was missing and presumed down, the Navy sprang into action to search for the airmen. Even before the final faint transmissions, search and rescue aircrafts were being readied. The moment Flight 19's distress was acknowledged, shortly after 5 p.m., all available resources in the area were alerted. By 7 p.m., as darkness covered Florida, authorities had mobilized the plan to comb the sea along the last estimated track of the flight. The first rescuers to launch were 2 Martin PBM mariners, flying boats from NAS Banana River, near Cocoa Beach on Florida's east coast. The PBM Mariner was a large amphibious aircraft, essentially a flying boat that could land on the sea, and it was often used in maritime rescue mission as a lifeguard plane. These particular PBMs were dispatched around 7:27 p.m., each with a crew of 13, and loaded with life rafts and survival gear. The hope was that Flight 19's men, if afloat, could be spotted and reached quickly by a seaplane that could land beside them. The Mariner with the call sign Training 49, barrel number 59225, took off and soon radioed a routine message to its base at 7:30 p.m., reporting it was on course. This was the last anyone heard from Training 49. About 20 minutes later, around 7:50 p.m., a merchant ship in the Atlantic, the SS Gaines Mills, observed something terrifying in the sky off the coast of central Florida. The crew saw a sudden bright fireball low in the horizon, which then disappeared. When the ship sailed towards that direction, they encountered a thick sheen of oil on the water's surface. The captain of the Gaines Mill reported these observations, suspecting that an aircraft had exploded and crashed at sea. The coordinates and timing matched exactly with the route the PBM Mariner Training 49 would have been flying. The Navy soon concluded that this rescue plane had exploded in midair and gone down with all 13 crewmen. PBM Mariner had a troubling reputation. Their crews nicknamed them flying gas tanks because they were known to accumulate gasoline vapors and could ignite with a single spark. It appears that is precisely what happened. The seaplane likely suffered a fuel vapor ignition that caused a catastrophic blast. There were no radio distress calls from the Mariner, indicating that the explosion was instantaneous. Tragically, the would-be rescuers perished before they could even begin their search. In the blink of an eye, the number of missing servicemen had grown to 27, 14 from Flight 19, and 13 from the PBM. Despite the secondary disaster, the overall search effort only intensified. All through that night of December 5th and into early morning hours of December 6th, a massive search and rescue operation scoured the sea and the coast. By dawn, the operation had grown into one of the largest air-sea searches in peacetime history. The U.S. Navy, Coast Guard, Army Air Forces, and even civilian boats and aircraft joined in. Over the next 5 days, from December 6th to December 10th, they covered an enormous area. Estimates say over 200,000 square miles of ocean were checked, from the Florida Straits up north to the Carolinas, and including parts of the Gulf of Mexico, just in case. At its peak, the search included hundreds of personnel and assets, at least 248 planes, Navy and Army, and 18 ships by one count. The aircraft carrier USS Solomons was deployed as a floating base to coordinate some of the aerial search efforts, and dozens of small vessels combed the waves. They also searched inland, in Florida swamps and Everglades, thinking perhaps the flight might have come down on land unnoticed. This was considered unlikely, but they checked anyways. The conditions during the initial search were challenging. The squalls and rough seas had developed on the 5th continued into the 6th. Some searchers reported waves up to 15 feet and strong winds, which would have dispersed any floating debris quickly. The hope was to find life rafts with survivor, but as hours turned into days, that hope dwindled. Not a single piece of wreckage from Flight 19 was found during the search. No oil slick aside from the one from the PBM. No floating bits of wood or life jackets, nothing. It was as if the ocean just swallowed the planes whole. Pilots and crew in the search efforts were baffled. Many of these were experienced World War II veterans who had seen planes go down before and knew that usually some trace floats to the surface. One of the Navy search pilots, Lieutenant David White, later expressed his amazement. They just vanished. We searched over land and water for days, and nobody ever found the bodies or any debris, he recalled. Lieutenant White believed the Flight 19 planes likely hit the ocean at high speed and broke apart, then sank rapidly in the deep water, making recovery nearly impossible. I don't think anybody got out. I don't think anybody survived, he said, noting how hitting the water at high velocity is like hitting a brick wall. His frank assessment was that the Avengers probably came down roughly 60 miles east of Daytona Beach in the Atlantic and sank before the men could deploy any rafts. By December 10th, 1945, after 5 fruitless days, the official search was called off. The Navy had to conclude that there was no hope of finding survivors by that point. Families of the missing were notified that their loved ones were missing and presumed dead. It was a heartbreaking and perplexing conclusion to an event that on the surface had no obvious cause. The only confirmed fact was that 5 planes and 14 men had disappeared, and a rescue plane and 13 more men had also vanished, all in the span of a few hours, in relatively normal weather, on a routine mission. This shocking outcome began to capture public attention, and newspapers dubbed Flight 19 the Lost Patrol, emphasizing the eerie aspect that multiple aircraft had been lost simultaneously without a trace. The stage was being set for an enduring legend, but before that legend took hold, the Navy needed to investigate what had actually happened. Chapter 7. The Navy Board of Inquiry. The U.S. Navy wasted no time in trying to find answers. Even as search teams were still out combing the ocean, the Navy convened a formal Board of Investigation, also known as Board of Inquiry, to look into Flight 19's incident. This was standard procedure for aviation accidents or losses, and given the high profile of losing 5 aircrafts at once, the Navy was under pressure to explain the tragedy. On December 7, 1945, just 2 days after the disappearance, the board assembled at Naval Air Station Jacksonville in Florida. Admiral Ralph Davidson, head of the Naval Air Advanced Training Command, appointed Captain Albert K. Morehouse, the commanding officer of NAS Miami, to lead the board. Serving with him were 2 senior Navy aviators, Commander Joseph Yavarsky and Commander Howard Roberts, and as a recorder to document testimony, Lieutenant Commander Richard Roberts from NAS Fort Lauderdale. The choice of officers ensured the board had expertise in flight training and local operations. Over the next few weeks, they gathered testimony, radio logs, weather reports, maintenance records, and any other evidence that could shed light on Flight 19's fate. The board's work was remarkably swift. By January 1946, they had completed their investigation and submitted a detailed report of findings. Some later criticized that this was perhaps too fast, rushed under public and media pressure, but the Navy was keen to address the situation promptly. The Board of Inquiry interviewed everyone involved who was available, from pilots like Lieutenant Robert Cox, who had communicated with Flight 19, to tower personnel, to training officers familiar with Lieutenant Taylor and his students. They even had access to the partial radio transcript and triangulation data from the day of the incident. We will summarize the key points of evidence they considered. Radio transmission. The board reviewed the logs of what was heard by various stations. Lieutenant Robert F. Cox's testimony was crucial. He recounted the radio exchange in which he first heard a distress call from Flight 19 around 3:40 p.m., and then engaged Lieutenant Taylor in conversations. Cox confirmed that Taylor reported his compasses not working and that he believed he might be over the Keys. Cox described how he gave Taylor instructions to fly north along the coast, assuming Taylor was in the Keys, and how Taylor's responses were confused and filled with uncertainty. Cox also noted that by about 4 p.m., his own aircraft's transmitter had malfunctioned, limiting his ability to continue guiding Flight 19. A bit of bad luck, which meant Taylor was largely on his own after that point. Tower and ground personnel. Navy tower operators and command officers from Fort Lauderdale and other bases testified about what they heard and what actions were taken. For instance, a duty officer at NAS Fort Lauderdale recalled that by 4 p.m., they knew Flight 19 was lost and attempts were being made to steer it west. The board learned that multiple messages were sent to Taylor advising him to let someone else lead the flight if that pilot had a good compass, or to switch to emergency frequencies. But those messages either didn't get through or were not heeded. The Port Everglades Navy radio log contained the suggestion: have a pilot with a good compass take over lead and guide you back to the mainland, which at one point Taylor acknowledged by saying Roger. However, it appears this advice was not effectively implemented in the chaos. Weather reports. The board examined the weather, testimony from meteorologists, and recorded data, showed that while the flight began in fair weather, the late afternoon saw a line of squalls move down the coast, originating from a front over Georgia. By about 4 p.m., conditions north of the Bahamas were deteriorating. Winds at 1,000 feet were around 40 miles per hour, and at higher altitude, even stronger. One report said 75 miles per hour at 8,000 feet, though Flight 19 was likely flying lower. Surface conditions were moderate to rough and got worse after nightfall. This corroborated the picture that Flight 19 flew into increasingly bad weather, which would have made navigation even more difficult. Navigation and equipment. A significant part of the investigation was technical. They confirmed that all Avengers on Flight 19 had been properly serviced and fueled before takeoff. The curious detail of the missing clocks was noted, but each pilot had a watch. The board did not deem that direct cause, though it was an unfortunate inconvenience. The maintenance log for the compasses were reviewed. None had known issues prior. It remained puzzling why Lieutenant Taylor reported both his compasses failed. It's possible they malfunctioned electronically. Avenger compasses could be thrown off by certain wiring issues, or if not calibrated, or he might have simply mistrusted them due to a false belief of where he was. The board couldn't be certain. They also considered the possibility of magnetic interference, later a point of the Bermuda Triangle lore, but found no evidence of unusual magnetism that day. Compasses in other planes at base were normal. Previous flight history. Lieutenant Taylor's record was examined. He was known as a competent pilot and instructor. However, some colleagues quietly noted, and the board was aware, that Taylor had a history of once or twice getting lost on navigation flights in the past. In the Pacific Theater during the war, there were unconfirmed anecdotes that Taylor had ditched an aircraft after getting disoriented, but specifics were lacking. Officially, his record did not show negligence. He had even been commended for one mission where he helped rescue a downed pilot in combat. The board did not want to rely on hearsay, but it kept this context in mind while assessing his actions. After gathering all evidence, the Board of Inquiry deliberated on what likely happened. They reconstructed the flight path of Flight 19 as best as data allowed. The flight probably flew northeast after the bombing run instead of properly turning west, then went further out to sea. The consensus they reached was that Lieutenant Taylor had become irredeemably lost and confused, leading his flight in the wrong direction until they ran out of fuel. In technical terms, the report concluded that the loss was due to navigational error. Specifically, it cited that Taylor was uncertain as to in what position lay the peninsula of Florida, a formal way of saying he didn't know where Florida was. This damning phrase underscored that the lead pilot fundamentally lost his sense of location. With no landfall in sight and night upon them, ditching was inevitable. And sadly, the conditions meant no survivors or debris could be recovered. The disappearance of the PBM Mariner was easier to explain. The board attributed that to an accidental mid-air explosion due to a faulty fuel system, noting the Gaines Mill sighting of flames and the oil. When the report was first drafted, it actually went so far as to imply Taylor had demonstrated something akin to mental lapse. One line suggested he had suffered temporary mental confusion or mental aberration due to the extreme stress and disorientation. This was essentially placing blame on pilot error, not just simple error, but an almost panicked breakdown of judgment. The Navy's tradition was often to hold the commanding officer, or flight leader in this case, accountable when no other cause was evident. However, accusing a missing war veteran of something like mental aberration raised some eyebrows. After all, Lieutenant Taylor wasn't around to defend himself, and no one could know exactly his mental state in those final hours. Nonetheless, the initial Board of Inquiry report essentially pinned the cause on Lieutenant Taylor's mistake, stating that if he had only flown west earlier, the flight would have likely made it back safely. The conclusion did not sit well with everyone. Even within the board and Navy leadership, there was discomfort. Some officers felt that, given the lack of physical evidence, no wreckage, no survivors, it might be too harsh and premature to solely blame Taylor. Yes, he appeared to have made serious navigational errors, but was it right to formally label him as effectively negligent or incapacitated? The board's verdict was about to face a challenge from an unlikely quarter, the family of Lieutenant Taylor himself, particularly his mother. Chapter 8: Controversy and Blame. Lieutenant Taylor's Exoneration. When the findings of the Board of Inquiry were finally communicated to the families of Flight 19, one person in particular was alarmed and determined to fight back. Lieutenant Charles Taylor's mother, Catherine Taylor, refused to accept the Navy's characterization of her son as the cause of the disaster. Catherine Taylor believed her son was being unfairly made a scapegoat for a sequence of events that was not fully understood. She knew her son was a capable, level-headed pilot and was convinced that if he got lost, it must have been due to circumstances beyond his control, faulty equipment, or unforeseen phenomena. He could not understand the idea that the official record would brand him with a pilot error or suggest he lost his wits. In early 1946, this grieving yet resolute mother began a campaign to clear Lieutenant Taylor's name. She wrote letters to high-ranking officials in the Navy Department, including the Secretary of the Navy, urging them to reconsider the verdict. She also reached out to sympathetic ears in Congress. Catherine's plea was essentially, without wreckage or survivors, how can you so definitively blame my son? Isn't it possible something else happened? She highlighted that Taylor had a distinguished service record and argued that branding him as grossly negligent was an injustice given the unknowns. Her persistence paid off in getting attention. Several members of Congress took interest in the Flight 19 case, partly due to her lobbying. Notably, Senator David Walsh of Massachusetts, who chaired the Senate Naval Affairs Committee, and some representatives like Milton West, Texas, and William Cole, New York, raised questions about the investigation's conclusion. Moreover, some within the Navy, such as Rear Admiral Ralph Jennings and Captain Ben Custer, quietly supported a review, acknowledging that the mental aberration line in the report seemed excessive. Under mounting pressure, the Navy agreed to re-examine the case through the Board of Correction of Naval Records. Essentially, an appeals board that could amend military records if an error or injustice was found. In 1947, Catherine Taylor got the hearing she had fought for. She and her attorney presented her arguments, and the original Flight 19 investigative materials were reviewed anew. The board weighed whether the official finding that Lieutenant Taylor was responsible was supported strongly enough by evidence, or whether it was, in their words, an injustice to his memory. After careful deliberation, the Board for Correction of Naval Records decided in Catherine's favor. They concluded that there was not enough certainty to hold Lieutenant Taylor accountable for the loss of Flight 19. Essentially, they determined that the Navy's original report had unfairly assigned blame to a man who wasn't alive to defend himself, and in a situation where crucial facts were missing. In 1947, the Navy amended the record of Flight 19 incident. The official cause of the loss was changed to cause unknown. In practical terms, this exonerated Lieutenant Taylor. No longer did the report say he had messed up or experienced mental confusion. Instead, it acknowledged that the cause of the disaster could not be determined with the evidence at hand. The wording was adjusted to avoid blaming Taylor. The Navy even noted they did so to avoid blaming Taylor for the loss of 5 aircraft and 14 men. Any references to mental aberration or gross navigational negligence was expunged. Lieutenant Taylor's service record was clear of any fault regarding Flight 19, preserving his honor as a naval aviator. Catherine Taylor's victory was somewhat rare. It's not often that a military board overturns part of a crash investigation, but her efforts underscore the ambiguities surrounding Flight 19. The Navy, in the end, officially admitted that it could not definitively explain what had happened. This outcome, while satisfying to Taylor's family, had an unintended side effect. It fed the mystery of Flight 19 in the public's mind. By stating cause unknown, the Navy left a blank slate upon which many would later write their own theories, some quite fantastical. Within naval circles, the Flight 19 case also prompted changes in procedures. Training flights were thereafter required to carry more reliable navigation aids and to adhere to stricter check-in protocols. The tragedy, though extraordinary, served as a lesson in the importance of instrument reliability and emergency communication. And Lieutenant Taylor, rather than being remembered as the man who got lost, was officially remembered as one of the many victims of an inexplicable peacetime accident. His mother's tenacity ensured that his reputation remained intact, and he was eventually awarded medals he had earned during World War II, delivered to his family without any strain from Flight 19 on his record. Chapter 9. The Bermuda Triangle legend grows. In the immediate aftermath of Flight 19, people were left scratching their heads. How could 5 robust Navy aircraft just disappear on a clear day, leaving no trace? The fact that it happened in a specific region of the Atlantic and that a rescue plane vanished too made it an intriguing story. Over the next few years and decades, this incident became one of the cornerstone tales of what we now call the Bermuda Triangle. At the time of Flight 19, the term Bermuda Triangle didn't exist yet. That phrase was coined in the 1960s, specifically in 1964, by writer Vincent Gaddis in a magazine article. However, the area bounded roughly by Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico had long been known for nautical mysteries. People later looked back and said, ah, Flight 19, that happened in the Triangle. And they grouped it with other unexplained disappearances in that region. One famous case often mentioned alongside Flight 19 is the USS Cyclops, a Navy cargo ship that vanished in 1918 with over 300 people on board. The Cyclops was lost without a distress call somewhere between Barbados and the Chesapeake Bay, and it was never found. That was perhaps the first big legendary triangle mystery. Then, after World War II, in addition to Flight 19, there were several airline disappearances. In December 1948, a Douglas DC-3 passenger plane with 36 people vanished en route from Puerto Rico to Miami, just disappeared in the night. In January 1948, a British airliner called the Star Tiger vanished approaching Bermuda. And in January 1949, another called the Star Ariel disappeared after leaving Bermuda. These incidents, all in roughly the same part of the Atlantic, captivated the public and defied easy explanation at the time. Each added to a growing sense that something was mysterious about this slice of the ocean. Flight 19, however, remained the most dramatic of these stories. 5 planes at once, a bunch of young servicemen, and those eerie radio transmissions of confusion. By the 1950s, some writers and radio programs began referring to the saga of Flight 19 in sensational terms, suggesting perhaps some unknown phenomena was at work. But it was in the 1960s and 1970s that the Bermuda Triangle legend really took off. Various authors wrote books with lurid tales of the Triangle. One such writer was Charles Berlitz, whose 1974 bestseller, The Bermuda Triangle, dedicated a chapter to Flight 19, embellishing the story with added mystery. Berlitz and others introduced ideas like perhaps Flight 19 encountered a strange electromagnetic anomaly that made their compasses go haywire, or they flew into a portal to another dimension. These books were not very concerned with sticking strictly to the Navy's account. They often omitted the fact that Lieutenant Taylor was likely just lost and that a storm hit. Instead, they played up any element that sounded unexplained. For instance, a favorite spooky quote that often get attributed to Flight 19 is, "Everything looked strange, even the ocean," or "We are entering white water, nothing seems right." In reality, those specific phrases were never in the official record. They seem to have been later fabrications or misremembered rumors. But once in print, they were widely repeated. In popular culture, Flight 19 got another boost of fame in 1977 with Steven Spielberg's film Close Encounters of the Third Kind. In the opening scene of that movie, a group of men in the Mexican desert stumbled upon 5 pristine TBM Avengers, and they are identified as the missing planes of Flight 19, suddenly returned years later with no pilots. It was a science fiction nod to the legend that maybe aliens abducted the planes. Later in that film, the pilots of Flight 19, looking the same age as in 1945, are returned to Earth by benevolent extraterrestrials. Of course, this was pure fantasy, but it centered Flight 19 in the public imaginations as the classic example of the Bermuda Triangle mystery, an enduring, unexplained vanishing. Let's clarify. The Bermuda Triangle lore suggests that within this triangular area, ships and planes mysteriously disappear at a higher rate than normal, often without a trace or explanation. Over time, people have proposed wild ideas. Maybe there's an ancient lost city on the seafloor emitting energies. Maybe there are rogue waves or magnetic vortices. Maybe UFOs use this area to capture humans for study. Maybe even a rift in space-time exists here. Flight 19 often gets a starring role in these speculations. It has been portrayed as a squadron that vanished into thin air, leaving experts baffled. However, it's important to separate legend from reality. In reality, as we have detailed, Flight 19's story, while tragic and unusual, has many rational elements. A likely navigational error, compasses possibly failing or misread, a storm, running out of fuel. The fact that nothing was found can be attributed to the vastness of the ocean and the difficulty of finding debris in rough seas, especially in 1945 without modern search technology. The United States Coast Guard and Navy have long maintained that the Bermuda Triangle is not statistically more dangerous than any other heavily traveled ocean region. In fact, the Coast Guard has often tried to debunk the triangle myths by pointing out that many supposed mysteries have prosaic explanations. Often storms were involved or errors, and the wreck simply sank out of sight. Noted researchers like Larry Cush explained Flight 19 and other triangle cases in the 1970s and found that when you go back to original sources, the mystery often evaporates. Cush famously concluded that the legend of the triangle was a manufactured mystery, amplified by authors who cherry-picked facts or didn't do proper research. Still, despite skeptical views, the romantic aura of Flight 19 persists. It's a story with all the elements that invite speculation. Experienced men lost without explanation. Final radio words that suggest disorientation. No wreckage ever found. In a geographic location with a spooky nickname. Over the years, some have even claimed paranormal aspects, like compasses spinning wildly or ghost planes being sighted. None of these have any evidence, but they make for a good ghost story. So if you visit naval air museums or read collections of unsolved mysteries, Flight 19 is invariably included. It has transcended its factual roots to become a kind of modern legend. The air patrol that flew into the unknown and never came back. In our calm telling here, we acknowledge those legends, but as we proceed, we will also explore what real-world explanations exist. Chapter 10. Plausible explanations. Putting aside the supernatural for the moment, Let's examine the conventional explanations for Flight 19's disappearance. From the evidence we have, the most likely scenario is a combination of human error, instrument malfunction, and natural factors, a perfect storm of misfortune rather than any single dramatic cause. 1. Navigational error and pilot disorientation. The heart of the matter is that Flight 19 simply got lost. Lieutenant Taylor, for reasons we've discussed, became convinced he was somewhere he was not. This kind of disorientation is not unprecedented. Taylor's misidentification of the Bahamian Islands as the Florida Keys was a crucial mistake. Once he believed that, every decision he made was based on a false premise. He thought flying northeast and east was bringing him back towards Florida, when it was actually taking him further into the Atlantic. The other pilots, though they had their doubts, largely followed his lead. In piloting, especially back then, dead reckoning, which is using course and speed over time, was key. If you start from a known point and keep a precise heading and timing, you should end up where intended. But if at some point you made an error, say you don't turn when you should, or you go the wrong heading, you can quickly become way off course without realizing it. Taylor's initial navigation after the bombing run might have been off. Perhaps strong winds carried Flight 19 further east than expected, or perhaps the flight didn't actually turn north at the correct spot. We know they did complete the bomb run at Hens and Chicken Shoals around 3 p.m., but from there, something went wrong. By 3:40 p.m., they were off course enough that Taylor was uncertain of his position. One theory is that Taylor mistook Great Abaco Island or another part of the Bahamas for the Keys, a plausible error if visibility was somewhat limited, or if he was relying on instinct from having flown in the Keys before. He had been based at NAS Miami previously, flying around the Keys region often. In short, pilot confusion set in, and once it did, it cascaded. Psychologically, when a pilot believes his instruments are wrong, saying east when he feels he's going west, for example, it's a dangerous situation. Taylor chose to trust his flawed perception over his instruments, leading them astray. This aspect is very much a human factor issue. No mysteries needed. Just the age-old problem of being lost and not believing your compass. 2. Compass malfunction or misreading. Adding to the above, we have Taylor's report that both my compasses are out. It's actually quite unusual for two independent compasses to fail completely. What might have happened? Possibility 1. There was indeed a magnetic anomaly or electrical issue on his plane. Perhaps a short circuit affected the compass. Avenger aircraft compasses could be thrown off by nearby magnetic influences, like if a wiring bundle was not shielded. If Taylor's primary compass, the magnetic ones, and his gyro compass, a secondary system, both gave inconsistent readings, he would have been understandably confused. Possibility 2. The compasses were mostly fine, but Taylor simply didn't trust them because the readings didn't match his expectations. If he thought he was flying west, but the compass said he was flying northeast, because in reality he was. He might conclude the compass was faulty. We should note, Flight 19's other planes didn't uniformly report compass failure. Some did mention issues, but not all. This suggests maybe a local interference, or again just that Taylor announced his were out and some others echoed they had problems too, which could even be them doubting their instruments. It's here that Bermuda Triangle enthusiasts like to say maybe the Earth's magnetic field did something odd. The Navy's investigation, however, found no evidence of unusual magnetism that day. The magnetic variation was within normal range, so a prosaic explanation is more likely. Perhaps a mechanical failure in Taylor's plane instruments. We'll never know for sure. What we do know is that lacking compass certainty, Taylor tried to navigate by sight and estimation, which become increasingly unreliable as conditions worsen. 3. Weather and nightfall. These natural factors turned a difficult situation into a desperate one. While the flight was in the air, sunset occurred around 5:29 p.m. Almost immediately after, the challenges multiplied. The pilots lost the reference of the sun in the horizon. Any lingering visual cues of land or cloud shapes became very hard to discern in the dark, especially if there was cloud cover. Meanwhile, the weather system that blew in created rain showers and likely low visibility. Even if Flight 19 had by chance been within 100 miles of Florida at dusk, they might not have seen the coastline or lights on land due to clouds cover and haze. The storm also kicked up the seas dramatically. We have reports of squalls and gusty winds up to 30 knots. The combination of night and storm is deadly for a ditched plane. Imagine trying to land an aircraft on rough, heavy seas in darkness. The pilot's depth perception is gone, and the waves can be like walls. If Flight 19 ditched under those conditions, the aircraft likely broke apart on impact. Avengers would afloat for a short time. They were designed to be buoyant for maybe a minute or two, but in strong waves, they might sink faster. The crew, if any survived the initial ditching, would have to escape quickly and deploy life rafts. With rain and wind, these rafts could easily be separated or flipped. It's heartbreaking to consider, but even if a few men survived the ditching, they could have succumbed to hypothermia or drowning before the searchers arrived. The weather basically erased their chance. 4. Fuel starvation. This is a simple but crucial point. The plane ran out of fuel. By all calculations, Flight 19's Avengers would have reached fuel exhaustion by about 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. that evening. They had taken off with enough fuel for maybe 5 to 6 hours max. Radio logs show Taylor gave the ditching order when one plane was at 10 gallons, which is almost empty. Avengers used around 60 gallons per hour at cruise. Once the engines started sputtering, each plane would have had minutes before going down. They were far from any land. We sometimes think, why not just bail out and parachute? Over the open ocean at night, that's not actually safer. You'd be dropping into high seas in darkness with no guarantee your rafts, packed in the plane, come out with you. Taylor's plan to ditch together was actually a sound strategy given the circumstances, trying to keep the crew close. But ultimately, fuel running out is an unforgiving situation. These planes, one by one, would have become gliders and fallen into the sea. This straightforwardly explains why Flight 19 ended up in the ocean. It might seem obvious, but it's worth stating. Once you have no fuel, gravity wins. The key question is when and where. And if that where is an area of deep ocean, parts of the Atlantic off Florida drop off to depths of thousands of feet. Finding them later becomes extremely difficult. 5. Explosion of the rescue plane. Though separate from the Flight 19's own navigational saga, the loss of the PBM Mariner adds to the tragedy. The Navy's investigation into that was clear. Witnesses saw a fireball and oil consistent with a fuel vapor explosion. Mariners were known for that hazard, so the rescue plane's disappearance is not mysterious when you know the type's history. It was an awful coincidence that on this night, a plane nicknamed Flying Gas Tank lived up to its name and eliminated itself. All 13 men aboard never had a chance. This incident did spur the Navy to improve safety on such aircraft later, but at the time, it just compounded the sense of something very wrong happened in that area that day. When you line up all these factors, a narrative picture emerged. Flight 19 likely flew northeast instead of west after the bombing run, due to a mistake. Lieutenant Taylor's compasses either failed or were believed to have failed, leading him to rely on what turned out to be a mistaken sense of direction. By the time they realized they were lost, they had probably passed well north of the Bahamas and were over open water. Attempts to find land went awry due to the fundamental misbelief of position. As daylight faded, so did their hopes, and ultimately they ditched in the Atlantic when fuel ran out. The ocean's depth and turbulence ensured that the plane sank without a trace. The subsequent massive search, though well-intentioned and extensive, was basically looking for needles, raft or debris in a vast, dark haystack. The official Navy conclusion after the revision was, as we said, cause unknown. This wasn't because they had no idea at all. It was because they couldn't prove the cause with certainty. However, internally and among most experts, the cause was essentially navigational error leading to fuel exhaustion and crash. There was no sign of sabotage, no enemy action. The war had ended months before and no hostile forces were in that region, and no evidence of some exotic natural disaster. It was a confluence of unfortunate errors and events. To this day, no wreckage of Flight 19 has been definitively found. Over the years, there have been tantalizing finds of sunken Avengers off the Florida coast, but none that could be conclusively linked to Flight 19's tail numbers. For example, in 1991, a search team thought they found Flight 19's planes off Fort Lauderdale, but it turned out to be a different group of Avenger wrecks from training incidents. The ocean still holds the secret of the exact resting place of the lost patrol, but given the passage of time, it's very likely the remains of those planes are scattered on the seabed, slowly corroding, hidden by sand and depth. In summary, The plausible explanation doesn't require sea monsters or time warps. Flight 19 got lost, ran out of gas, and crashed at sea. The additional tragedy of the PBM Mariner exploding only added to the myth, but itself was a known risk with a sadly straightforward explanation. Chapter 11: Exotic Theories and Fringe Speculations. While the sober analysis above satisfies most pilots and investigators, the mysterious aura around Flight 19 has also given rise to numerous fringe theories. These ideas venture beyond conventional science and into the realm of the paranormal or speculative. For comprehensive telling, we will explore them here calmly, not because we endorse them, but because they have become part of the folklore of Flight 19. 1. Alien abduction. One of the most sensational explanations is that Flight 19 fell victim to extraterrestrial intervention. In the heyday of UFO fascination, the 1950s and onward, it was suggested that maybe a flying saucer or some alien force swooped down and snatched the planes out of the sky. Proponents of this theory often point to the fact that no wreckage was ever found, implying the planes might have been taken. The image of 5 planes simply vanishing lends itself to imaginative scenarios. The Spielberg film Close Encounters played with this idea, as we mentioned, by having the planes reappear intact decades later, as if deposited back by aliens. Of course, there's zero evidence for this. No strange lights were reported by Flight 19 or any nearby aircraft that day, and all the radio communications suggest the pilots were dealing with terrestrial navigation problem, not fleeing from a UFO. Nonetheless, in some books and documentaries, you'll hear the alien theory brought up. It's the ultimate deus ex machina explanation for an unsolved case. Maybe aliens did it. A related claim sometimes heard in these circles is that one of the last messages from Flight 19 was, "We are not alone," or "They look like they're from outer space." These are all complete fabrications, not found in any official record, but they've been repeated in some sensational accounts. Similarly, a Navy official's offhand comment, "They flew off to Mars," which was just a frustrated quip during the search, has been misinterpreted by some as if the Navy seriously considered alien abduction. In reality, the vast majority of Flight 19 communication and focus was on trying to find Florida, not battling ETs. So while alien abductions make for an intriguing sci-fi storyline, it remains in the realm of pure conjecture and Hollywood storytelling when it comes to Flight 19. 2. Dimensional portals and time warp. Another exotic idea is that Flight 19 accidentally flew into some kind of time-space anomaly, a rift. The so-called agonic line passes near there. But this is a known and charted aspect. Navigators are taught about it. The notion of a sudden magnetic field surge or a local magnetic vortex messing with Flight 19 is not supported by any recordings. All other flights and ships in the area that day had normal readings. Could an undersea mineral deposit or some geomagnetic storm have thrown off their compasses? Unlikely. A geomagnetic storm from solar activity would have affected others too and tends to disrupt radios more than compasses. And a local deposit strong enough to affect compasses over a wide area is practically unheard of. So while Flight 19 did have compass troubles, a mystery spot of magneticism is not a necessary explanation. Basic instrument or pilot error suffices. Nonetheless, in triangle lore, you'll hear talks of compass gyrations and such. 5. Government experiments. Another theory in the Fringe catalog is that perhaps Flight 19 stumbled into a secret military experiment. Given the timing, right after World War II, when a lot of new tech was being developed, some theorists imagine the Navy or other entity might have been testing something in the area, say a new weapon, or radar jamming technology, or even something like the Philadelphia experiment. In this scenario, Flight 19 could have been accidentally destroyed or displaced by a test gone wrong, and the truth covered up. For instance, one could theorize they flew through a test area for an electronic cloaking device which scrambled their instruments and then maybe caused them to crash, with the record hushed to conceal this project. Another angle is the idea of reverse-engineered alien tech, tying to the UFO idea being tested. However, there is no evidence in declassified military archives that anything of the sort was happening off Florida's coast that day. The 1940s did have some nascent electronic warfare research, but nothing suggests a scenario that would vaporize planes. Moreover, multiple people heard Flight 19's radio conversations. It was no secret they were lost in communicating. If a secret test had incapacitated them, it didn't silence their radios at first. Also, if there were any hints of a cover-up, one would expect parts of the official records to be missing or classified. But the Flight 19 incident is well documented and available in Navy files. In fact, the Navy was quite transparent in saying we don't know exactly what happened. Conspiracies thrive on secrecy. Here, the mystery is more the lack of data from the planes themselves because they sank than withheld data from the Navy. Still, those inclined to suspect cover-up, Flight 19's lack of physical evidence provides a canvas to imagine that the true cause was hidden. There's an old joke that the most outlandish explanation someone gave was that Flight 19 somehow got involved in the Philadelphia experiment, a supposed 1943 invisibility project, and got teleported. This, of course, crosses into pure science fiction. In presenting these fringe theories, we maintain a calm perspective. They are interesting as cultural phenomena, showing how humans try to explain the unexplainable. Flight 19's mythos has grown precisely because people seek extraordinary answers for extraordinary events. It's worth noting that every single element invoked by these theories, aliens, time warps, Atlantis, secret weapons, has no evidence in the actual historical record of Flight 19. There are add-ons that came years later as the story was retold. If one stripped those away and looked strictly at what Flight 19's men said and did, the story is tragic, but not incomprehensible. Yet the fringes of speculation will always cling to cases like this, keeping the public intrigued. Many documentaries about the Bermuda Triangle will inevitably dramatize Flight 19 with spooky music and maybe a suggestion of something otherworldly, because it makes for captivating television. In our narrative here, we acknowledge these tales, but with gentle skepticism. It is possible to honor the mystery of Flight 19 in the sense that we still haven't found the planes, without invoking the paranormal. But the paranormal ideas are undeniably a part of the Flight 19 legend now, so one will continue to hear them in any discussion of the Bermuda Triangle. Chapter 12. Aftermath. In the decades since 1945, Flight 19 has continued to fascinate researchers, historians, and treasure hunters. The Navy may have closed the case within unknown cause, but that hasn't stopped people from trying to find physical remains of the lost patrol or to uncover new information. We will now calmly recount some notable post-1945 developments and enduring puzzles related to Flight 19, including a curious story that emerged about one crew member potentially surviving, a story that remains unproven but intriguing. Many individuals and teams have looked for Flight 19's wrecks over the years. The challenge is enormous. The Atlantic Ocean is vast, and the possible crash zone covers thousands of square miles if you include all the conjectured routes. In the pre-sonar and pre-ROV remote operated vehicles era, finding sunken aircraft was mostly a matter of chance. For example, a fisherman snagging something or a diver happening upon it. In the 1980s and beyond, with better technology, a few concerted efforts were made. One came in the early 1990s, when a salvage company thought they had located 5 Avengers wrecks not far off the Florida coast. Excitement grew. Could this be the Flight 19 at last? However, upon investigation, those planes turned out to have bureau numbers that did not match Flight 19's aircraft. Instead, they were determined to be other TBM Avengers from training accidents during World War II. Florida's coastal waters had seen numerous crashes during the war. NAS Fort Lauderdale alone trained thousands of pilots. So finding Avenger wrecks wasn't unusual. They just weren't those Avengers. One story that has circulated involves a discovery on land, not in the ocean. In 1963, a man named Graham Steichletter, while hunting in a remote part of the Florida Everglades near Sebastian, Florida on the East Coast, stumbled upon the wreckage of a World War II era plane deep in a swamp. Inside the wreck, he found the remains of 2 crew members, just skeletal remains by then. It was clearly an old Navy aircraft, specifically a TBM Avenger. Steichletter reported it to the Navy, who came and recovered the wreckage and the remains. At the time, he overheard one naval officer on the scene make a brief remark that the wreck must be related to Flight 19. This offhand comment linked the find to the famous Lost Patrol. However, after that, the Navy said little. They did not publicly identify the plane or the bodies. Stikelether made inquiries, even using friends in high places, but always hit a dead end. He was essentially told not to pursue it further. This shroud of semi-secrecy, whether bureaucratic or intentional, led to speculation that perhaps one of Flight 19's planes had actually crashed on land, and maybe the Navy didn't want it widely known for whatever reason. Decades later, an aviation researcher named John Mayer, who happens to live in Sebastian, Florida, became deeply involved in investigating Flight 19. In the 1980s, Mayer theorized that not all Flight 19 planes necessarily went down at sea. Some might have turned and headed back late, maybe crashing in Florida after all. He wasn't initially aware of Stikelether's discovery, but in 1989, Omni magazine published a story on Flight 19 and mentioned Mayer's research. Stikelether reading it and realized Mayer might be interested in what he found in 1963. The two connected and pooled information. Mayer dug through records and pieced together a hypothesis. The Sebastian Swamp wreck could be FT-36, one of Flight 19's Avengers. FT-36 was the aircraft piloted by Captain Edward Powers, the Marine captain trainee. Powers' crew on Flight 19 included Sergeant Howell Thompson, the gunner, and Sergeant George Paonessa, the radio man. Notably, FT-36 was the only Flight 19 plane that had 3 Marines on board. All others had at least one Navy man. Mayer knew the Navy had said the recovered remains were not positively identified, at least publicly. But he also knew that if any were Marines, it might correlate to FT-36. According to the story, Navy's files on the 1963 wreck had the names redacted when Mayer requested them decades later, fueling his suspicion that indeed tied to Flight 19. Here's where it gets even more curious. Mayer learned of a family anecdote from the Paonessa family. Sergeant George R. Paonessa was the radio man on FT-36. On December 26, 1945, just 3 weeks after Flight 19 vanished, Paonessa's family in New York received a Western Union telegram that stunned them. The telegram, purportedly sent from NAS Jacksonville, read, "You have been misinformed about me. Am very much alive. Georgie." Georgie was Paonessa's nickname in the family. This telegram suggested that George Paonessa had somehow survived whatever happened to Flight 19 and was alive on December 26th. The family was overjoyed at first, naturally. They thought he might have been found, but nothing further came. The Navy never confirmed any survivors. The telegram's origin remains mysterious. Was it a hoax? A mistake? Or could Paonessa truly have made it to land and sent that message, only to disappear again? Mayer, hearing of this, noted that in the Everglades wreck, only 2 bodies were found. If that were the FT-36, it would mean one of the three crew was not in the wreck, potentially having bailed out or wandered off. If Palnesa was the one missing, since presumably the pilot and gunner might have stayed with the plane, could he have survived and then sent the telegram before possibly going into hiding? It's a dramatic theory and sounds like something out of a movie. The Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale Museum and its historians, including Minerva Bloom, have kept records of these accounts. Minerva Bloom has spoken about the telegram, saying that many believed it was likely a hoax, but she isn't 100% sure. One reason being that only someone close to the family would know to call him Georgie. The telegram itself is still kept by Palnesa's relatives as a cherished, if puzzling, memento. Officially, the Navy has never acknowledged any survivor from Flight 19, nor have they confirmed the Sebastian wreck's identity. If indeed that wreck was one of the Flight 19s, it would mean at least one plane did not go down in the Atlantic with the others. Could Flight 19 have split up near the end, with one plane flying a different direction? We know Taylor wanted to keep them together, but perhaps one disobeyed or got separated, maybe FT-36. That plane might have turned and flown until it ran out of fuel over Florida, crashing in the swamps. As of now, this remains an intriguing footnote rather than a confirmed theory. John Mayer published the book Discovery of Flight 19, in which he advocates that scenario and continues to press for more information. He filed Freedom of Information Act requests, but they yielded scant details due to the redaction. Graham Steichleather passed away in 2009, but he too maintained that the 1963 find was significant to Flight 19. Without firm evidence, like matching serial numbers or DNA identification of remains to known crew families, the survivor Georgie story remains an unsolved mystery within the mystery. If George Palnesa did somehow survive and chose to disappear intentionally, one wonders why. Was he perhaps suffering trauma or amnesia? Or did he survive long after sending that wire? More likely, skeptics say the telegram was a cruel prank or a mix-up. In the chaos after the war, telegram errors weren't unheard of. Perhaps someone sent a message meant for another family, or it was entirely fabricated by someone with dark humor. We will likely never know the truth, unless new documents surface. Even in recent years, expeditions have been launched to search for Flight 19, often with advanced sonar and underwater drones. The History Channel and other outlets have occasionally funded searches in deep water based on new clues or refined hypotheses of where the planes might have gone down. So far, none have conclusively found them. There was a moment in 2015 where an underwater exploration off the coast of Florida found some aircraft wreckage that sparked headlines, but it turned out to be an old 90s era plane, not from World War II. Flight 19's Avengers remain elusive. Some say they might lie in the Gulf Stream's path and could have been carried far from the ditching point by currents before sinking. Others think they could be in the deep tongue of the ocean east of the Bahamas. It's a tough search, akin to the search for other famous lost planes, like MH370 in the Indian Ocean. The Flight 19 tragedy thus lives on not in just memory and story, but in the ongoing desire of people to find closure, literally to find the planes and know where the crew came to rest. If one day the Avengers are found on the seabed, it will answer some questions like their final location, but likely won't change the fundamental understanding of what happened. Still, it would be meaningful for history and the families. As we conclude this extensive, calm exploration of Flight 19, we reflect on why this story endures. It's partly the dramatic elements, vanishing planes, cryptic last messages, and partly the aura of the Bermuda Triangle that enveloped it later. It's also because these were young men who had survived a world war, only to be lost on a training mission in peacetime, which feels especially poignant. The lack of closure, no bodies, no funerals, leaves a lasting ache and curiosity. In the end, the most plausible explanation remains the simplest. Flight 19 got lost and ran out of fuel over the ocean, leading all 5 planes crashing at sea. Their loss, while tragic, can be understood through the lens of human error and natural forces. But as we've seen, around that core fact has grown a rich tapestry of legend, speculation, and even hope. We have covered the story from its beginning to its aftermath in detail and with a calm tone, suitable for a thoughtful reflection. As you drift off, imagine those TBM Avengers flying in formation one last time, their engines humming in the late afternoon sky. They are out there over the blue Atlantic, the sun glinting off their wings. They turn west, heading home. But night falls too soon. In the darkness and rain, they close up tight, looking out for each other to the end. And then, silence. Just the wind and waves. It is a somber image, but also one of camaraderie and bravery in the face of the unknown. Flight 19's story remains with us, part cautionary tale, part enduring mystery, as we remember the 27 souls lost that day in the ocean that keeps their secret.